Recorded Books Incorporated presents an unabridged recording of My Side of the Mountain by Gene Craighead George, narrated by Jeff Woodman. This work, copyrighted 1959 by Gene Craighead George, is recorded by arrangement with Dutton Children's Books, a division of Penguin, USA. This recording is copyrighted 1994 by Recorded Books Incorporated. Gene Craighead George writes in the preface to this book, "When I was in elementary school, I packed my suitcase and told my mother I was going to run away from home. As I envisioned it, I would live by a waterfall in the woods and catch fish on hooks made from the forks of tree limbs, as I had been taught by my father. I would walk among the wildflowers and trees, listen to the birds, read the weather report in the clouds and the wind, and stride down mountainsides independent and free. Wisely, my mother did not try to dissuade me. She had been through this herself. She checked my bag to see if I had my toothbrush and a postcard to let her know how I was getting along, and kissed me goodbye. 40 minutes later, I was home. When my daughter Twig was in elementary school, she told me she was going to run away to the woods. I checked her backpack for her toothbrush and watched her go down the front steps, her shoulders squared confidently. I blew her a kiss and sat down to wait. Presently she was back. Although wishing to run to the woods and live on our own seems to be an inherited characteristic in our family, we are not unique. Almost everyone I know has dreamed at some time of running away to a distant mountain or island, castle or sailing ship, to live there in beauty and peace. Few of us make it, however. It is one thing to wish to go, and another matter to do it. I might have been able to do what Sam Gribley does in this book, live off the land, make a home, survive by wits and library research, for I had the knowledge. My father, who was a naturalist and scientist, taught me the plants and animals of eastern forests and showed me where the wild edible fruits and tubers grew. On weekends along the Potomac River near Washington, D.C., where I was born and grew up, he and I boiled water in leaves and made rabbit traps. Together we made tables and chairs out of saplings bound with the braided inner bark of the basswood tree. My brothers, two of the first falconers in the United States, helped me in the training of a falcon. I had the know-how for surviving in the woods, and yet I came home. But not Sam, I said to myself when I sat down at my typewriter and began putting on paper this story, one that I had been writing in my head for many, many years. The writing came easily. Sam needed a home. I remembered a huge tree my brothers had camped in on an island in the Potomac River. A tree would be Sam's home, and I knew how he would survive when foraging became tough. A falcon will be his provider, I said to myself. With ideas coming fast, the first draft was done in 2 weeks. 5 revisions later, it was finished and off to the publisher. Back came a phone call from Sharon Bannigan, the editor of E.P. Dutton's children's book department at that time. "Elliot McCrae, the publisher," she said, "won't print the book. He says parents should not encourage their kids to leave home." Discouraged, I hung up the phone and walked out into the woods behind the house. As always, when I'm in the wildwood, I very quickly forgot what was troubling me. A sentinel crow was protecting its flock by watching the sky for hawks. A squirrel was building a nest of leaves for the winter. A spider was tapping out a message to his mate on a line of her web. Better to run to the woods than the city, I thought. Here there is the world to occupy the mind. The telephone rang. Sharon Bannigan was back on the wire, and she was almost singing. Elliot McCrae had changed his mind. And what, I asked her, had worked the miracle? I simply told him it is better to have children run to the woods than the city, she said. He thought about that, Since he has a home in the wilds of the Adirondack Mountains and goes off there alone himself, he suddenly understood your book. My Side of the Mountain will be published in the spring of '59. From that date to this, I have been answering children's letters about Sam. Most want to know if he is a real person. Some, convinced that he is, have biked to Delhi, New York, from as far away as Long Island, New York, to find his tree, his falcon, weasel, and raccoon. To these and all others who ask, I say, there is no real Sam, except inside me. His adventures are the fulfillment of that day long ago when I told my mother I was going to run away, got as far as the edge of the woods, and came back. Perhaps Sam will fulfill your dreams, too. Be you writer or reader, it is very pleasant to run away in a book. And now, My Side of the Mountain.
In which I hole up in a snowstorm. I'm on my mountain in a tree home that people have passed without ever knowing that I'm here. The house is a hemlock tree, 6 feet in diameter, and must be as old as the mountain itself. I came upon it last summer and dug and burned it out until I made a snug cave in the tree that I now call home. My bed is on the right as you enter, and is made of ash slats and covered with deerskin. On the left is a small fireplace about knee-high. It's of clay and stones. It has a chimney that leads the smoke out through a knothole. I chipped out 3 other knotholes to let fresh air in. The air coming in is bitter cold. It must be below 0 outside, and yet I can sit here inside my tree and write with bare hands. The fire is small, too. It doesn't take much fire to warm this tree room. It's the 4th of December, I think. It may be the 5th. I'm not sure because I haven't recently counted the notches in the aspen pole that's my calendar. I've been just too busy gathering nuts and berries, smoking venison, fish, and small game to keep up with the exact date. The lamp I'm writing by is deer fat poured into a turtle shell with a strip of my old city trousers for a wick. It snowed all day yesterday and today. I haven't been outside since the storm began, and I'm bored for the first time since I ran away from home 8 months ago to live on the land. I'm well and healthy. The food is good. Sometimes I eat turtle soup, and I know how to make acorn pancakes. I keep my supplies in the wall of the tree in wooden pockets that I chopped myself. Every time I've looked at those pockets during the last 2 days, I've felt just like a squirrel, which reminds me, I didn't see a squirrel 1 whole day before that storm began. I guess they're holed up and eating their stored nuts, too. I wonder if the Baron, that's the wild weasel who lives behind the big boulder to the north of my tree, is also denned up. Well, anyway, I think the storm is dying down because the tree's not crying so much. When the wind really blows, the whole tree moans right down to the roots, which is where I am. Tomorrow I hope the Baron and I can tunnel out into the sunlight. I wonder if I should dig the snow. But that would mean I'd have to put it somewhere, and the only place to put it is in my nice snug tree. Maybe I can pack it with my hands as I go. I've always dug into the snow from the top, never up from under. The Baron must dig up from under the snow. I wonder where he puts what he digs. Well, I guess I'll know in the morning. When I wrote that last winter, I was scared, and thought maybe I'd never get out of my tree. I'd been scared for 2 days, ever since the first blizzard hit the Catskill Mountains. When I came up to the sunlight, which I did by simply poking my head into the soft snow and standing up, I laughed at my dark fears. Everything was white, clean, shining, and beautiful. The sky was blue, blue, blue. The hemlock grove was laced with snow. The meadow was smooth and white, and the gorge was sparkling with ice. It was so beautiful and peaceful that I laughed out loud. I guess I laughed because my first snowstorm was over, and it hadn't been so terrible after all. Then I shouted, "I did it!" My voice never got very far. It was hushed by the tons of snow. I looked for signs from the Baron Weasel. His footsteps were all over the boulder, also slides where he had played. He must have been up for hours, enjoying the new snow. Inspired by his fun, I poked my head into my tree and whistled. Frightful, my trained falcon flew to my fist, and we jumped and slid down the mountain, making big holes and trenches as we went. It was good to be whistling and carefree again, because I was sure scared by the coming of that storm. I'd been working since May, learning how to make a fire with flint and steel, finding what plants I could eat, how to trap animals and catch fish. All this so that when the curtain of blizzard struck the Catskills, I could crawl inside my tree and be comfortably warm and have plenty to eat. During the summer and fall, I had thought about the coming of winter. However, on that third day of December when the sky blackened, the temperature dropped and the first flakes swirled around me. I must admit that I wanted to run back to New York. Even the first night that I spent out in the woods, when I couldn't get the fire started, wasn't as frightening as the snowstorm that gathered behind the gorge and mushroomed up over my mountain. I was smoking 3 trout. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. I was busy keeping the flames low so they wouldn't leap up and burn the fish. As I worked, it occurred to me that it was awfully dark for that hour of the morning. Frightful was leashed to her tree stub. She seemed restless and pulled at her tethers. Then I realized that the forest was dead quiet. Even the woodpeckers that had been tapping around me all morning were silent. The squirrels were nowhere to be seen. The juncos and chickadees and nuthatches were gone. I looked to see what the Baron Weasel was doing. He wasn't around. I looked up. From my tree you can see the gorge beyond the meadow. White water pours between the black, wet boulders and cascades into the valley below. The water that day was as dark as the rocks. Only the sound told me it was still falling. Above the darkness stood another darkness. The clouds of winter, black and fearsome. They looked as wild as the winds that were bringing them. I grew sick with fright. I knew I had enough food. I knew everything was going to be perfectly all right. But knowing that didn't help. I was scared. I stamped out the fire and pocketed the fish. I tried to whistle for Frightful, but couldn't purse my shaking lips tight enough to get out anything but shh. So I grabbed her by the hide straps that are attached to her legs, and we dove through the deerskin door into my room in the tree. I put Frightful on the bedpost and curled up in a ball on the bed. I thought about New York and the noise and the lights, and how a snowstorm always seemed very friendly there. I thought about our apartment, too. At that moment it seemed bright and lighted and warm. I had to keep saying to myself there were 11 of us in it. Dad, Mother, 4 sisters, 4 brothers, and me. And not one of us liked it, except perhaps little Nina, who was too young to know. Dad didn't like it even a little bit. He'd been a sailor once, but when I was born he gave up the sea and worked on the docks in New York. Dad didn't like the land. He liked the sea, wet and big and endless. Sometimes he'd tell me about great-grandfather Gribley, who owned land in the Catskill Mountains and felled the trees and built a home and plowed the land, only to discover that he wanted to be a sailor. The farm failed, and great-grandfather Gribley went to sea. As I lay with my face buried in the sweet, greasy smell of my deerskin, I could hear Dad's voice saying, "That land is still in the family's name. Somewhere in the Catskills is an old beach with the name Gribley carved on it. It marks the northern boundary of Gribley's Folly. The land is no place for a Gribley." "The land is no place for a Gribley," I said. "The land is no place for a Gribley, and here I am 300 feet from the beach with Gribley carved on it." I fell asleep at that point, and when I awoke I was hungry. I cracked some walnuts, got down the acorn flour I had pounded, with a bit of ash to remove the bite, reached out the door for a little snow, and stirred up some acorn pancakes. I cooked them on a top of a tin can, and as I ate them, smothered with blueberry jam, I knew that the land was just the place for a Gribley. In which I get started on this venture. I left New York in May. I had a penknife, a ball of cord, an axe, and $40, which I had saved from selling magazine subscriptions. I also had some flint and steel, which I had bought at a Chinese store in the city. The man in the store had showed me how to use it. He had also given me a little purse to put it in and some tinder to catch the sparks. He had told me that if I ran out of tinder, I should burn cloth and use the charred ashes. I thanked him and said, "This is the kind of thing I'm not going to forget." On the train north to the Catskills, I unwrapped my flint and steel and practiced hitting them together to make sparks. On the wrapping paper, I made these notes. A hard, brisk strike is best. Remember to hold the steel in the left hand and the flint in the right, and hit the steel with the flint. The trouble is the sparks go every which way. And that was the trouble. I didn't get a fire going that night, and as I mentioned, this was a scary experience. I hitched rides into the Catskill Mountains. At about 4 o'clock, a truck driver and I passed through a beautiful, dark hemlock forest, and I said to him, "This is as far as I'm going." He looked all around and said, "You live here?" "No," I said, "but I'm running away from home, and this is just the kind of forest I've always dreamed I'd run to. I think I'll camp here tonight." I hopped out of the cab. "Hey, boy," the driver shouted, "are you serious?" "Sure," I said. "Well, now ain't that something? You know, when I was your age, I did the same thing. Only thing was, I was a farm boy and ran to the city, and you're a city boy running to the woods. I was scared of the city. Do you think you'll be scared of the woods?" "Heck no," I shouted loudly. As I marched into the cool, shadowy woods, I heard the driver call to me, "I'll be back in the morning if you want to ride home." He laughed. Everybody laughed at me. Even Dad. I told Dad that I was going to run away to Great-Grandfather Gribley's land. He had roared with laughter and told me about the time he'd run away from home. He got on a boat headed for Singapore, but when the whistle blew for departure, he was down the gangplank and home in bed before anyone knew he was gone. Then he told me, "Sure, go try it. Every boy should try it." I must have walked a mile into the woods until I found a stream. It was a clear, athletic stream that rushed and ran and jumped and splashed. Ferns grew along its banks, and its rocks were upholstered with moss. I sat down, smelled the piney air, and took out my penknife. I cut off a green twig and began to whittle. I've always been good at whittling. I carved a ship once that my teacher exhibited for Parents' Night at school. First, I whittled an angle on one end of the twig. Then I cut a smaller twig and sharpened it to a point. I whittled an angle on that twig and bound the two angles face to face with a strip of green bark. It was supposed to be a fishhook. According to a book on how to survive on the land that I read in the New York Public Library, this was the way to make your own hooks. I then dug for worms. I had hardly chopped the moss away with my axe before I hit frost. It hadn't occurred to me that there'd be frost in the ground in May, but then I hadn't been on a mountain before. This did worry me, because I was depending on fish to keep me alive until I got to my great-grandfather's mountain, where I was going to make traps and catch game. I looked into the stream to see what else I could eat, and as I did, my hand knocked a rotten log apart. I remembered about old logs and all the sleeping stages of insects that are in it. I chopped away until I found a cold white grub. I swiftly tied a string to my hook, put the grub on it, and walked up the stream looking for a good place to fish. All the manuals I had read were very emphatic about where fish lived, and so I had memorized this. In streams, fish usually congregate in pools and deep, calm water. The heads of riffles, small rapids, the tail of a pool, eddies below rocks or logs, deep undercut banks, in the shade of overhanging bushes, all are very likely places to fish. This stream didn't seem to have any calm water, and I must have walked 1,000 miles before I found a pool by a deep undercut bank in the shade of overhanging bushes. Actually, it wasn't that far, it just seemed that way, because as I went looking and finding nothing, I was sure I was going to starve to death. I squatted on this bank and dropped in my line. I did so want to catch a fish. One fish would set me upon my way, because I had read how much you could learn from one fish. By examining the contents of its stomach, you can find what the other fish are eating, or you can use the internal organs as bait. The grub went down to the bottom of the stream. It swirled around and hung still. Suddenly, the string came to life and rode back and forth and around in a circle. I pulled with a powerful jerk. The hook came apart, and whatever I had went circling back to its bed. Well, that almost made me cry. My bait was gone, my hook was broken, and I was getting cold, frightened, and mad. I whittled another hook, but this time I cheated and used string to wind it together instead of bark. I walked back to the log and luckily found another grub. I hurried to the pool, and I flipped a trout out of the water before I knew I had a bite. The fish flopped, and I threw my whole body over it. I couldn't bear to think of it flopping itself back into the stream. I cleaned it like I'd seen the man at the fish market do, examined its stomach, and found it empty. This horrified me. What I didn't know was that an empty stomach means the fish are hungry and will eat about anything. However, I thought at the time that I was a goner. Sadly, I put some of the internal organs on my hook, and before I could get my line to the bottom, I had another bite. I lost that one, but got the next one. I stopped when I had 5 nice little trout and looked around for a place to build a camp and make a fire. It wasn't hard to find a pretty spot along that stream. I selected a place beside a mossy rock in a circle of hemlocks. I decided to make a bed before I cooked. I cut off some boughs for a mattress. Then I leaned some dead limbs against the boulder and covered them with hemlock limbs. This made a kind of tent. I crawled in, lay down, and felt alone and secret and very excited. But the rest of this story. I was on the northeast side of the mountain. It grew dark and cold early. Seeing the shadows slide down on me, I frantically ran around gathering firewood. This is about the only thing I did right from that moment until dawn, because I remembered that the driest wood in a forest is the dead limbs that are still on the trees, and I gathered an enormous pile of them. That pile must still be there, for I never got a fire going. I got sparks, sparks, sparks. I even hit the tinder with the sparks. The tinder burned all right, but that was as far as I got. I blew on it, I breathed on it, I cupped it in my hands, but no sooner did I add twigs than the whole thing went black. Then it got too dark to see. I clicked steel and flint together, even though I couldn't see the tinder. Finally, I gave up and crawled into my hemlock tent, hungry, cold, and miserable. I can talk about that first night now, although it's still embarrassing to me because I was so stupid and scared that I hate to admit it. I had made my hemlock bed right in the stream valley where the wind drained down from the cold mountain top. It might have been all right if I had made it on the other side of the boulder, but I didn't. I was right on the main highway of the cold winds as they tore down upon the valley below. I didn't have enough hemlock boughs under me, and before I had my head down, my stomach was cold and damp. I took some boughs off the roof and stuffed them under me, and then my shoulders were cold. I curled up in a ball and was almost asleep when a whippoorwill called. If you've ever been within 40 feet of a whippoorwill, you'll understand why I couldn't even shut my eyes. They're deafening. Well, anyway, the whole night went like that. I don't think I slept 15 minutes, and I was so scared and tired that my throat was dry. I wanted a drink, but didn't dare go near the stream for fear of making a misstep and falling in and getting wet. So I sat tight and shivered and shook, and now I'm able to say I cried a little tiny bit. Fortunately, the sun has a wonderfully glorious habit of rising every morning. When the sky lightened, when the birds awoke, I knew I would never again see anything so splendid as the red, round sun coming up over the earth. I was immediately cheered and set out directly for the highway. Somehow, I thought that if I was a little nearer the road, everything would be all right. I climbed a hill and stopped. There was a house. A house, warm and cozy, with smoke coming out of the chimney and lights in the windows, and only 100 feet from my torture camp. Without considering my pride, I ran down the hill and banged on the door. A nice old man answered. I told him everything in one long sentence, and then said, "And so, can I cook my fish here, because I haven't eaten in years?" He chuckled, stroked his whiskery face, and took the fish. He had them cooking in a pan before I knew what his name was. When I asked him, he said Bill something, but I never heard his last name because I fell asleep in his rocking chair that was pulled up beside his big, hot, glorious wood stove in the kitchen. I ate the fish some hours later, also some bread, jelly, oatmeal, and cream. Then he said to me, "Sam Gribley, if you're going to run off and live in the woods, you better learn how to make a fire. Come with me." We spent the afternoon practicing. I penciled these notes on the back of a scrap of paper so I wouldn't forget. When the tinder glows, keep blowing and add fine dry needles one by one, and keep blowing, steadily, lightly, and evenly. Add 1-inch dry twigs to the needles, and then give her a good big handful of small dry stuff. Keep blowing. The manner in which I find Gribley's farm. The next day, I told Bill goodbye, and as I strode, warm and fed, onto the road, he called to me, "I'll see you tonight. The back door'll be open if you want a roof over your head." I said okay, but I knew I wouldn't see Bill again. I knew how to make fire, and that was my weapon. With fire, I could conquer the Catskills. I also knew how to fish. To fish and to make a fire, that was all I needed to know, I thought. 3 rides that morning took me to Delhi. Somewhere around here was great-grandfather's beech tree with the name Gribley carved on it. This much I knew from Dad's stories. By 6 o'clock, I still hadn't found anyone who had even heard of the Gribleys, much less Gribley's Beach, and so I slept on the porch of a schoolhouse and ate chocolate bars for supper. It was cold and hard, but I was so tired I could have slept in a wind tunnel. At dawn, I thought real hard. Where would I find out about the Gribley farm? "Some old map," I said. Where would I find an old map? The library? Maybe. I'd try it and see. The librarian was very helpful. She was sort of young, had brown hair and brown eyes, and loved books as much as I did. The library didn't open until 10:30. I got there at 9. After I had lolled and rolled around and sat on the steps for 15 or 20 minutes, the door whisked open, and this tall lady asked me to come on in and browse around until opening time. All I said to her was that I wanted to find the old Gribley farm, and that the Gribleys hadn't lived on it for maybe 100 years, and she was off. I can still hear her heels click when I think of her, scattering herself around those shelves, finding me old maps, histories of the Catskills, and files of letters and deeds that must have come from attics around Delhi. Miss Turner, that was her name, found it. She found Gribley's farm in an old book of Delaware County. Then she worked out the roads to it, and drew me maps and everything. Finally, she said, "What do you want to know for? Some school project?" "Oh, no, Miss Turner, I want to go live there." "But, Sam, it's all forest and trees now. The house is probably only a foundation covered with moss." "That's just what I want. I'm going to trap animals and eat nuts and bulbs and berries and make myself a house. You see, I'm Sam Gribley, and I thought I'd like to live on my great-grandfather's farm." Miss Turner was the only person that believed me. She smiled, sat back in her chair, and said, "Well, I declare." The library was just opening when I gathered the notes we had made and started off. As I pushed open the door, Miss Turner leaned over and said to me, "Sam, we have some very good books on plants and trees and animals in case you get stuck." I knew what she was thinking, and so I told her I'd remember that. With Miss Turner's map, I found the first stone wall that marked the farm. The old roads to it were all grown up and mostly gone, but by locating the stream at the bottom of the mountain, I was able to begin at the bridge and go north and up 1.5 miles. There, caterpillaring around boulders, roller-coastering up ravines and down hills, was the mound of rocks that had once been great-grandfather's boundary fence. And then, do you know, I couldn't believe I was there. I sat on the old gray stones a long time, looking through the forest, up that steep mountain, and saying to myself, it must be Sunday afternoon, and it's raining, and Dad is trying to keep us all quiet by telling us about great-grandfather's farm, and he's telling it so real that I can see it. And then I said, no, I am here, because I was never this hungry before. I wanted to run all the way back to the library and tell Miss Turner that I'd found it. Partly because she would have liked to have known, and partly because Dad had said to me as I left, if you find the place, tell someone at Delhi. I may visit you someday. Of course he was kidding, because he thought I'd be home the next day. But after many weeks, maybe he would think I meant what I said, and he might come see me. However, I was too hungry to run back. I took my hook and line and went back down the mountain to the stream. I caught a big old catfish. I climbed back to the stone wall in great spirits. It was getting late, so I didn't try to explore. I went right to work making a fire. I decided that even if I didn't have enough time to cut boughs for a bed, I was gonna have a cooked fish and a fire to huddle around during those cold night hours. May isn't exactly warm in the Catskills. By firelight that night, I wrote this. Dear Bill, that was the old man. After 3 tries, I finally got a handful of dry grass on the glow in the tinder. Grass is even better than pine needles, and tomorrow I'm going to try the outside bark of the river birch. I read somewhere that it has combustible oil in it that the Indians use to start fires. Anyway, I did just what you showed me and had cooked catfish for dinner. It was good. Your friend, Sam. After I wrote that, I remembered I didn't know his last name, and so I stuffed the note in my pocket, made myself a bed of boughs and leaves in the shelter of the stone wall, and fell right to sleep. I must say this now about that first fire. It was magic. Out of dead tinder and grass and sticks came a live, warm light. It cracked and snapped and smoked and filled the woods with brightness. It lighted the trees and made them warm and friendly. It stood tall and bright and held back the night. Oh, this was a different night than the first dark, frightful one. Also, I was stuffed on catfish. I've since learned to cook it more, but never have I enjoyed a meal as much as that one, and never have I felt so independent again. In which I find many useful plants. The following morning, I stood up, stretched, and looked about me. Birds were dripping from the trees, little birds singing and flying and pouring over the limbs. This must be the warbler migration, I said, and I laughed because there were so many birds. I had never seen so many. My big voice rolled through the woods, and their little voices seemed to rise and answer me. They were eating. 3 or 4 in a maple tree near me were darting along the limbs, pecking and snatching at something delicious on the trees. I wondered if there was anything there for a hungry boy. I pulled a limb down, and all I saw were leaves, twigs, and flowers. I ate a flower. It wasn't very good. One manual I had read said to watch what the birds and animals were eating in order to learn what's edible and non-edible in the forest. If the animal life can eat it, it's safe for humans. The book did suggest that a raccoon had tastes more nearly like ours. Certainly the birds were no example. Then I wondered if they weren't eating something I couldn't see. Tiny insects, perhaps. Well, anyway, whatever it was, I decided to fish. I took my line and hook and walked down to the stream. I lay on a log and dangled my line in the bright water. The fish weren't biting. That made me hungrier. My stomach pinched. You know, it really does hurt to be terribly hungry. A stream is supposed to be full of food. It's the easiest place to get a lot of food in a hurry. I needed something in a hurry, but what? I looked through the clear water, and saw the tracks of mussels in the mud. I ran along the log back to shore, took off my clothes, and plunged into that icy water. I collected almost a peck of mussels in very little time at all, and began tying them in my sweater to carry them back to camp. But I don't have to carry them anywhere, I said to myself. I have my fire in my pocket. I don't need a table. I can sit right here by the stream and eat. And so I did. I wrapped the mussels in leaves and sort of steamed them in coals. They're not quite as good as clams, a little stronger, I'd say, but by the time I'd eaten 3, I'd forgotten what clams tasted like and knew only how delicious freshwater mussels were. I actually got full. I wandered back to great-grandfather's farm and began to explore. Most of the acreage was maple and beech, some pine, dogwoods, ash, and here and there a glorious hickory. I made a sketch of the farm on my road map and put X's where the hickories were. They were gold trees to me. I'd have hickory nuts in the fall. I could also make salt from hickory limbs. I cut off one and chopped it into bits and scraps. I stuck them in my sweater. The land was up and down and up and down, and I wondered how great-grandfather ever cut it and plowed it. There was one stream running through it, which I was glad to see, for it meant I didn't have to go all the way down the mountain to the big creek for fish and water. Around noon, I came upon what I was sure was the old foundation of the house. Miss Turner was right. It was ruins. A few stones in a square, a slight depression for the basement, and trees growing right up through what had once been the living room. I wandered around to see what was left of the Gribley home. After a few looks, I saw an apple tree. I rushed up to it, hoping to find an old apple. No apples beneath it. About 40 feet away, however, I found a dried one in the crotch of a tree, stuck there by a squirrel and forgotten. I ate it. It was pretty bad, but nourishing, I hoped. There was another apple tree and 3 walnuts. I scribbled X's. These were wonderful finds. I poked around the foundations, hoping to uncover some old iron implements that I could use. I found nothing. Too many leaves had fallen and turned to loam. Too many plants had grown up and died down over the old home site. I decided to come back when I had made myself a shovel. Whistling and looking for food and shelter, I went on up the mountain, following the stone walls, discovering many things about my property. I found a marsh. In it were cattails and arrowleaf, good starchy foods. At high noon, I stepped onto a mountain meadow. An enormous boulder rose up in the center of it. At the top of the meadow was a fringe of white birch. There were maples and oaks to the west, and a hemlock forest to the right that pulled me right across the sweet grasses into it. Never, never have I seen such trees. They were giants, old, old giants. They must have begun when the world began. I started walking around them. I couldn't hear myself step, so dense and damp were the needles. Great boulders covered with ferns and moss stood among them. They looked like pebbles beneath those trees. Standing before the biggest and the oldest and the most king-like of them all, I suddenly had an idea. This is about the old, old tree. I knew enough about the Catskill Mountains to know that when the summer came, they were covered with people. Although great-grandfather's farm was somewhat remote, still hikers and campers and hunters and fishermen were sure to wander across it. Therefore, I wanted a house that couldn't be seen. People would want to take me back where I belonged if they found me. I looked at that tree. Somehow I knew it was home, but I wasn't quite sure how it was home. The limbs were high and not right for a treehouse. I could build a bark extension around it, but that would look silly. Slowly, I circled the great trunk. Halfway around, the whole plan became perfectly obvious. To the west, between 2 of the flanges of the tree that spread out to be roots, was a cavity. The heart of the old tree was rotting away. I scraped at it with my hands. Old, rotten, insect-ridden dust came tumbling out. I dug on, using my axe from time to time as my excitement grew. With much of the old rot out, I could crawl in the tree and sit cross-legged. Inside, I felt as cozy as a turtle in its shell. I chopped and chopped until I was hungry and exhausted. I was now in the hard, good wood, and chopping it out was work. I was afraid December would come before I got a hole big enough to lie in. So I sat down to think. You know, those first days, I just never planned right. I had the beginnings of a home, but not a bite to eat, and I had worked so hard that I could hardly move forward to find that bite. Furthermore, it was discouraging to feed that body of mine. It was never satisfied, and gathering food for it took time and got it hungrier. Trying to get a place to rest it took time and got it more tired, and I really felt I was going in circles, and wondered how primitive man ever had enough time and energy to stop hunting food and start thinking about fire and tools. I left the tree and went across the meadow looking for food. I plunged into the woods beyond, and there I discovered the gorge and the white cascades splashing down the black rocks into the pool below. I was hot and dirty. I scrambled down the rocks and slipped into the pool. It was so cold I yelled. But when I came out on the bank and put on my 2 pairs of trousers and 3 sweaters, which I thought was a better way to carry clothes than in a pack, I tingled and burned and felt coltish. I leapt up the bank, slipped, and my face went down in a patch of dogtooth violets. You'd know them anywhere after a few looks at them at the botanical gardens and in colored flower books. They're little yellow lilies on long, slender stems with oval leaves dappled with gray. But that's not all. They have wonderfully tasty bulbs. I was filling my pockets before I got up from my fall. "I'll have a salad-type lunch," I said, as I moved up the steep sides of the ravine. I discovered that, as late as it was in the season, the spring beauties were still blooming in the cool pockets of the woods. They're all right raw, that is if you're as hungry as I was. They taste a little like lima beans. I ate these as I went on hunting food, feeling better and better until I worked my way back to the meadow where the dandelions were blooming. Funny I hadn't noticed them earlier. Their greens are good, and so are their roots. A little strong and milky, but you get used to that. A crow flew into the aspen grove without saying a word. The little I knew of crows from following them in Central Park, they always have something to say. But this bird was sneaking, obviously trying to be quiet. Birds are good food. Crow is certainly not the best, but I didn't know that then, and I launched out to see where it was going. I had a vague plan to try to noose it. This is the kind of thing I wasted time on in those days when time was so important. However, this venture turned out all right, because I didn't have to noose that bird. I stepped into the woods, looked around, couldn't see the crow, but noticed a big stick nest in a scrabbly pine. I started to climb the tree. Off flew the crow. What made me keep on climbing in face of such discouragement, I don't know, but I did, and that noon I had crow eggs and wild salad for lunch. At lunch, I also solved the problem of carving out my tree. After a struggle, I made a fire. Then I sewed a big skunk cabbage leaf into a cup with grass strands. I had read that you can boil water in a leaf, and ever since then, I'd been very anxious to see if this were true. It seems impossible, but it works. I boiled the eggs in a leaf. The water keeps the leaf wet, and although the top dries up and burns down to the water level, that's as far as the burning goes. I was pleased to see it work. Then here's what happened. Naturally, all this took a lot of time, and I hadn't gotten very far on my tree, so I was fretting and stamping out the fire when I stopped with my foot in the air. The fire! Indians made dugout canoes with fire. They burned them out, an easier and much faster way of getting results. I'd try fire in the tree. If I was very careful, perhaps it'd work. I ran into the hemlock forest with a burning stick and got a fire going inside the tree. Thinking that I ought to have a bucket of water in case things got out of hand, I looked desperately around me. The water was far across the meadow and down the ravine. This'd never do. I began to think the whole inspiration of a home in the tree was no good. I really did have to live near water for cooking and drinking and comfort. I looked sadly at the magnificent hemlock and was about to put the fire out and desert it when I said something to myself. It must have come out of some book. Hemlocks usually grow around mountain streams and springs. I swirled on my heel. Nothing but boulders around me. But the air was damp. "Somewhere," I said, and darted around the rocks, peering and looking and sniffing and going down into pockets and dales. No water. I was coming back, circling wide, when I almost fell in it. 2 sentinel boulders, dripping wet, decorated with flowers, ferns, moss, weeds, everything that loved water, guarded a bathtub-sized spring. "You pretty thing," I said, flopped on my stomach, and pushed my face into it to drink. I opened my eyes. The water was like glass, and in it were little insects with oars. They rowed away from me. Beetles skittered like bullets on the surface, or carried a silver bubble of air with them to the bottom. Ah, then I saw a crayfish. I jumped up, overturned rocks, and found many crayfish. At first I hesitated to grab them, because they can pinch. I gritted my teeth, thought about how much more it hurts to be hungry, and came down upon them. I did get pinched, but I had my dinner. And that was the first time I had planned ahead. Any planning that I did in those early days was such a surprise to me and so successful that I was delighted with even a small plan. I wrapped the crayfish in leaves, stuffed them in my pockets, and went back to the burning tree. Bucket of water, I thought. Bucket of water? Where was I going to get a bucket? How did I think, even if I found water, I could get it back to the tree? That's how citified I was in those days. I had never lived without a bucket before. Scrub buckets, water buckets, and so when a water problem came up, I just thought I could run to the kitchen and get a bucket. Well, dirt's as good as water, I said as I ran back to my tree. I can smother the fire with dirt. Days passed working, burning, cutting, gathering food, and each day I cut another notch on an aspen pole that I had stuck in the ground for a calendar. In which I meet one of my own kind and have a terrible time getting away. 5 notches into June, my house was done. I could stand in it, lie down in it, and there was room left over for a stump to sit on. On warm evenings, I'd lie on my stomach and look out the door, listen to the frogs and nighthawks, and hope it would storm so that I could crawl into my tree and be dry. I'd gotten soaked during a couple of May downpours, and now that my house was done, I wanted the chance to sit in my hemlock and watch a cloudburst wet everything but me. This opportunity didn't come for a long time. It was dry. One morning, I was at the edge of the meadow. I had cut down a small ash tree and was chopping it into lengths of about 18 inches each. This was the beginning of my bed that I was planning to work on after supper every night. With the golden summer upon me, food was much easier to get, and I actually had several hours of free time after supper in which to do other things. I had been eating frogs' legs, turtles, and best of all, an occasional rabbit. My snares and traps were set now. Furthermore, I had a good supply of cattail roots I had dug in the marsh. If you ever eat cattails, be sure to cook them well. Otherwise the fibers are tough, and they take more chewing to get the starchy food from them than they're worth. However, they taste just like potatoes after you've been eating them a couple of weeks, and to my way of thinking are extremely good. Well, anyway, that summer morning when I was gathering material for a bed, I was singing and chopping and playing a game with a raccoon I'd come to know. He had just crawled in a hollow tree and had gone to bed for the day when I came to the meadow. From time to time I would tap on his tree with my axe. He'd hang his sleepy head out, snarl at me, close his eyes and slide out of sight. The third time I did this, I knew something was happening in the forest. Instead of closing his eyes, he pricked up his ears, and his face became drawn and tense. His eyes were focused on something down the mountain. I stood up and looked. I could see nothing. I squatted down and went back to work. The raccoon dove out of sight. "Now what's got you all excited?" I said, and tried once more to see what he had seen. I finished the posts for the bed and was looking around for a bigger ash to fell and make slats for the springs when I nearly jumped out of my shoes. "Now what are you doing up here all alone?" It was a human voice. I swung around and stood face to face with a little old lady in a pale blue sunbonnet and a loose brown dress. "Oh, gosh," I said, "don't scare me like that. Say one word at a time until I get used to a human voice." I must have looked frightened, because she chuckled, smoothed down the front of her dress, and whispered, "Are you lost?" "Oh, no, ma'am," I stuttered. "Then a little fellow like you should not be all alone way up here on this haunted mountain." "Haunted?" said I. "Yes, indeed. There's an old story says there are little men up here who play ninepins right down in that gorge in the twilight." She peered at me. "Are you one of them?" "Oh, no, I said. "I read that story. It's just make-believe." I laughed, and she puckered her forehead. "Well, come on," she said. "Make some use of yourself and help me fill this basket with strawberries." I hesitated. She meant my strawberry supply. "Now get on with you. A boy your age should be doing something worthwhile instead of playing mumbly-peg with sticks. Come on, young man." She jogged me out into the meadow. We worked quite a while before we said any more. Frankly, I was wondering how to save my precious, precious strawberries, and I may say I picked slowly. Every time I dropped one in her basket, I thought how good it would taste. "Where do you live?" I jumped. It's terribly odd to hear a voice after weeks of listening only to birds and raccoons, and what's more, to hear the voice ask a question like that. "I live here," I said. "You mean Delhi? Fine. You can walk me home." Nothing I added did any good. She wouldn't be shaken from her belief that I lived in Delhi. So I let it go. We must have reaped every last strawberry before she stood up, put her arm in mine, and escorted me down the mountain. I certainly was not escorting her. Her wiry little arms were like crayfish pinchers. I couldn't have gotten away if I'd tried. So I walked and listened. She told me all the local and world news, and it was rather pleasant to hear about the National League, an atom bomb test, and a Mr. Riley's three-legged dog that chased her chickens. In the middle of all this chatter, she said, "That's the best strawberry patch in the entire Catskill Range. I come up here every spring. For 40 years I've come to that meadow for my strawberries. It gets harder every year, but there's no jam can beat the jam from that mountain. I know. I've been around here all my life." Then she went right into the New York Yanks without putting in a period. As I helped her across the stream on big boulders, I heard a cry in the sky. I looked up. Swinging down the valley on long, pointed wings was a large bird. I was struck by the ease and swiftness of its flight. "Duckhawk," she said. "Nest around here every year. My man used to shoot 'em. He said they killed chickens, but I don't believe it. The only thing that kills chickens is Mr. Riley's three-legged dog." She tipped and teetered as she crossed the rocks, but kept right on talking and stepping as if she knew that no matter what, she would get across. We finally reached the road. I wasn't listening to her very much. I was thinking about the duckhawk. This bird, I was sure, was the peregrine falcon, the king's hunting bird. "I'll get one. I'll train it to hunt for me," I said to myself. Finally, I got the little lady to her brown house at the edge of town. She turned fiercely upon me. I started back. "Where are you going, young man?" I stopped. Now, I thought, she's going to march me into town. Into town? Well, that's where I'll go then, I said to myself. And I turned on my heel, smiled at her, and replied, to the library. The King's Provider. Miss Turner was glad to see me. I told her I wanted some books on hawks and falcons, and she located a few, although there wasn't much to be had on the subject. We worked all afternoon, and I learned enough. I departed when the library closed. Miss Turner whispered to me as I left, "Sam, you need a haircut." I hadn't seen myself in so long that this hadn't occurred to me. "Gee, I don't have any scissors." She thought a minute, got out her library scissors, and sat me down on the back steps. She did a fine job, and I looked like any other boy who had played hard all day and who, with a little soap and water after supper, would be going off to bed in a regular house. I didn't get back to my tree that night. The May apples were ripe, and I stuffed on those as I went through the woods. They taste like a very sweet banana, are earthy and a little slippery, but I liked them. At the stream, I caught a trout. Everybody thinks a trout is hard to catch because of all the fancy gear and flies and lines sold for trout fishing, but honestly, they're easier to catch than any other fish. They have big mouths and snatch and swallow whole anything they see when they're hungry. With my wooden hook in its mouth, the trout was mine. The trouble is that trout aren't hungry when most people have time to fish. I knew they were hungry that evening because the creek was swirling and minnows and everything else were jumping out of the water. When you see that, go fish. You'll get them. I made a fire on a flat boulder in the stream and cooked the trout. I did this so I could watch the sky. I wanted to see the falcon again. I also put the trout head on a hook and dropped it in the pool. A snapping turtle would view a trout head with relish. I waited for the falcon patiently. I didn't have to go anywhere. After an hour or so, I was rewarded. A slender speck came from the valley and glided above the stream. It was still far away when it folded its wings and bombed the earth. I watched. It arose, clumsy and big, carrying food, and winged back to the valley. I sprinted down the stream and made myself a lean-to near some cliffs where I thought the bird had disappeared. Having learned that day that duckhawks prefer to nest on cliffs, I settled for this site. Early the next morning, I got up and dug the tubers out of the arrow leaf that grew along the stream bank. I baked these and boiled mussels for breakfast. Then I curled up behind a willow and watched the cliff. The falcons came in from behind me and circled the stream. They'd apparently been out hunting before I'd gotten up, as they were returning with food. This was exciting news. They were feeding young, and I was somewhere near the nest. I watched one of them swing into the cliff and disappear. A few minutes later it winged out, empty-footed. I marked the spot mentally and said, "Ha." After splashing across the stream in the shallows, I stood at the bottom of the cliff and wondered how on earth I was going to climb the sheer wall. I wanted a falcon so badly, however, that I dug in with my toes and hands and started up. The first part was easy. It wasn't too steep. When I thought I was stuck, I found a little ledge and shinnied up to it. I was high, and when I looked down, the stream spun. I decided not to look down anymore. I edged up to another ledge and lay down on it to catch my breath. I was shaking from exertion, and I was tired. I looked up to see how much higher I had to go when my hand touched something moist. I pulled it back and saw that it was white. Bird droppings. Then I saw them. Almost where my hand had been sat 3 fuzzy whitish-gray birds. Their wide-open mouths gave them a startled look. "Oh, hello, hello," I said. "You are cute." When I spoke, all 3 blinked at once. All 3 heads turned and followed my hand as I swung it up and toward them. All 3 watched my hand with opened mouths. They were marvelous. I chuckled, but I couldn't reach them. I wormed forward and wham! Something hit my shoulder. It pained. I turned my head to see the big female. She had hit me. She winged out, banked, and started back for another strike. Now I was scared, for I was sure she'd cut me wide open. With sudden nerve, I stood up, stepped forward, and picked up the biggest of the nestlings. The females are bigger than the males. They are the falcons. They are the pride of kings. I tucked her in my sweater and leaned against the cliff, facing the bullet-like dive of the falcon. I threw out my foot as she struck, and the sole of my tennis shoe took the blow. The female was now gathering speed for another attack, and when I say speed, I mean 50 to 60 miles an hour. I could see myself, battered and torn, lying in the valley below, and I said to myself, "Sam Gribley, you had better get down from here like a rabbit." I jumped to the ledge below, found it was really quite wide, slid on the seat of my pants to the next ledge, and stopped. The hawk apparently couldn't count. She didn't know I had a youngster, for she checked her nest, saw the open mouths, and then she forgot me. I scrambled to the riverbed somehow, being very careful not to hurt the hot, fuzzy body that was against my own. However, Frightful, as I called her right then and there because of the difficulties we'd had in getting together, didn't think so gently of me. She dug her talons into my skin to brace herself during the bumpy ride to the ground. I stumbled to the stream, placed her in a nest of buttercups, and dropped beside her. I fell asleep. When I awoke, my eyes opened on 2 gray eyes in a white Strubly head. Small pin feathers were sticking out of the Strubly down like feathers in an Indian quiver. The big blue beak curled down in a snarl and up in a smile. "Oh, Frightful," I said, "you are a raving beauty." Frightful fluffed her nubby feathers and shook. I picked her up in the cup of my hands and held her under my chin. I stuck my nose in the deep, warm fuzz. It smelled dusty and sweet. I liked that bird. Oh, how I liked that bird from that smelly minute. It was so pleasant to feel the beating life and see the funny little awkward movements of a young thing. The legs pushed out between my fingers. I gathered them up, together with the thrashing wings, and tucked the bird in one piece under my chin. I rocked. "Frightful," I said, "you'll enjoy what we're going to do." I washed my bleeding shoulder in the creek, tucked the torn threads of my sweater back into the hole they had come out of, and set out from my tree.
This ends Disc 1.